I have the pleasure now of introducing Walter Walsh. Well, you have the full version in the program, but Walter is Associate Professor of Law at the University of Washington, Seattle, and he's been on the law school faculty there since 1998. He had been a Golub Fellow in legal history here at NYU School of Law. He's visiting professor at the Central European University, Budapest, and also at the University of Chicago Law School. He is also the biographer of William Sampson. His doctoral dissertation at Yale, right? Harvard, I'm sorry, at Harvard was on William Sampson, and which is the subject of his talk today. He will, we've done a lot of talking about the trial so far, People v. Phillips and the context of it, and yet for some of you here, you won't know just who this man is and why he bothered to take on this trial. Walter and I go back at least 20 years. We met when we were in graduate school, and we have shared the presidency of the New York Irish History Roundtable. I think you succeeded me. Did you? After?
I don't know.
I don't know the order, but well, we come. Either I came before him or he came before me. Anyway, and at that time, 20 years ago, we started to dream up something like, which is evolving right this minute, and it's incredible to be here and have the privilege of introducing Walter. One of the things we did back in those days was restore the gravestone of Matilda Tone, Theobald Wolfe Tone's widow, who is buried in Greenwood Cemetery, where we are all going tomorrow, those of you who are welcome to come. And there is a coach leaving from Ireland House at noon. First come, first serve for seating on it. If you wish to go on the coach to Greenwood, there's a sign-up sheet also at the back. But I remember from that wonderful program we did in Greenwood Cemetery, in the lead-up to it, Walter pointed out that William Sampson is buried in the same plot as Matilda Tone, and the big, tall, 6-foot brownstone headstone was lying flat. And so Walter lay down on William Sampson's grave. He stretched out on the grave and, dreamed this weekend. So here we are, okay. He also, in the course of his research, tracked down Sampson's relatives and had access to a private collection of Sampson's letters, which inform a lot of his work as well. So, and Walter has, we've invited him, he's been a speaker at Ireland House in the past. He was our O'Malley lecturer a few years ago, in which he talked about another trial that Sampson argued, which was the 1824 Orange Green Riot trial here in Greenwich Village, which is published in the Ireland House's journal. It was called Ryark at that time. So it's available. If anybody you want to know more about William Sampson, that's not People v. Phillips, you can look at that. Okay, so without further ado, please welcome Walter Walsh.
Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. I have been asked to speak on how William Sampson, who was born in 1764, came to be amicus curiae in People versus Phillips in the context of his interests in radical politics and human rights law. And so my answer to that is coming from really the same course that I'm teaching at the University of Washington. I call that Rights, Revolutions, Republics, 1750 to 1850, the work and works of William Sampson. The date 1750 to 1850, when you think about it, there's something extraordinary, which I have to admit I only recently recognized, which is that Sampson's life is exactly bisected by the year 1800. He lived for 36 years prior to 1800 in the 18th century, and then for 36 years in the 19th century. He died in 1836. And as it happens, his life can be divided into hexennials, 6-year periods, and they tend to fall on very epochal moments, I would say. But when you think about it then, so he was, if you take the year 1750, for example, just a few years, 14 years before his birth, that is a completely different world. The ancien regime that he lived in, was born into with the penal laws of Ireland in place, than the world that he died in, because again, 14 years after his death was the year 1850, industrialized America. So his life, in so many ways, really embodies this extraordinary century where we shift from revolution into the post-colonial modern world that we live in today. So in 1750, as you have seen by law in Ireland, the Catholic, Gaelic-speaking majority in Ireland, they cannot vote, sit in Parliament, own land, attend university, hold government office, serve in juries, practice law, and so forth. From exile, Sampson is keenly aware of how far his distant ideals have led him from the easy future that once beckoned. He had spurned his natural place in the small but dominant Protestant ascendancy, an oligarchy maintained by a rigid system of political, economic, and religious repression of the impoverished Catholic masses. Sampson knew well that my interest, my connections, and my hopes lay decidedly with the court party rather than the people, but he nevertheless viewed resistance against that establishment as the only moral course of action. Being of the favoured caste and far from having any personal griefs, the road to advancement, on the contrary, very open to me. I could have no motive but that of compassion for my country. I never was inclined to political contention, and it required strong conviction to move me to sedition. But there are moments when to be passive is to be criminal, as when we see a murder committed before our eyes and do not stretch our hand. The griefs of Irishmen are undeniable, but when torture and every other enormity was superadded to those wrongs, the voice of a nation and the laws of God set openly at defiance, I asked myself by what tie I was bound to submit, for I had not sworn allegiance to the Prince of Darkness. Sampson's connections, intimacies, youthful habits, and ties of blood lay on the one side, while the voice of reason and humanity and the instinctive horror of oppression and cruelty called him to the other. How many ties, he asked, must then be rent asunder? William Sampson's odyssey began in the city of Derry on January the 17th, 1764. William was the youngest of 5 children born to the Reverend Arthur Sampson, an Anglican minister, and his wife Mary Spate. William's brother George traced the family's history back to Richard, son of the Bishop of Lichfield in Coventry, who came to Ireland during the reign of Elizabeth, bringing with him 100 halberdiers to support the authority of Her Majesty and his own possessions. For the next 3 generations, Richard's descendants held the rank of colonel in the British Army, and for 3 generations after that were beneficed clergymen of the established church. George followed his father into the rectory, and one of William's 2 sisters married another Anglican minister. With these traditions, support of the Protestant establishment must surely have seemed Sampson's destiny. But perhaps ominously, Sampson's mother was related to Richard Dobbs Spate, signer of the U.S. Constitution. In Sampson's words, Catholics were to be thrown on the mercy of their persecutors. Reflecting upon the Irish laws in 1813 in the Phillips case that existed as he was growing up, Sampson observed that the tormentors sought out every tender part where the moral being could be afflicted, and cruelly conveyed the maddening poison through every organ of most exquisite sensibility, insulting religion, reversing the principles of law, violating parental affection, private friendship, filial duty, conjugal love, promoting family dissension, preventing education, proscribing industry, and having done all this, setting a bar against all future acquisitions of wealth, influence, or knowledge. In short, leaving nothing that hell could invent unattempted in order to brutalize and enfeeble a race of beings whose courage and intellect was still formidable, even in this abject state. Sampson noted the formidable ideological capacity of the Irish penal laws to obscure authentic moral and legal norms, especially in a colonial common law system. It appears throughout this code, he pointed out, that all principles of law are reversed and go by contraries, and that what is law for Protestants is not for Catholics, and vice versa. It is not therefore wonderful that those familiarized to it by education and habit should judge in the same perverse sense, even where there was no statute precisely oversetting the principles of the law. From when he was 3 or 4 years old, Sampson was raised in a Spartan manner by a maiden aunt. In the words of his daughter Catherine, she brought him up hardily, having the ice broken in winter to plunge him into the cold water beneath. Her plan succeeded, and he grew strong and healthy. In 1776, when Sampson was a boy of just 12 years old, as he later described it, the American Revolution reduced the theories of the great philosophers of England, France, and other countries into practice, and persecutors began to find themselves surprised, like owls overtaken by the day. Even in Ireland, Sampson wrote, "The cheering ray pierced the gloomy night of oppression. It awaked the sleeping genius of a reanimated people and raised up those champions of civil and religious rights within and without the walls of Parliament, whose splendid eloquence showed the native measure of many a thousand souls that bondage had degraded." Already as a youth, Samson's adventurous spirit drew him far from familiar surroundings. While on one expedition to barren Tory Island off the coast of Donegal, the young Samson was caught alone in a boat during rough seas. After a night or two, he fell senseless, but was luckily cast ashore. When he revived, he was stretched on a bed in a cabin and surrounded by women lamenting over him with great eloquence of speech and gesture. He remained here for some days, treated by the poor and ignorant inhabitants with great kindness. Samson's solitary journey to that bleak and lonely western island on that occasion suggests that it was probably not his first visit. And this incident shed some light on his unusual appreciation of the culture and language of the Catholic peasantry and his sympathy for the hardships they endured. Samson stood in sharp contrast to the radical Protestant intellectuals with whom he later associated, most of whom were far more conversant with classical antiquity, British constitutional history, and French revolutionary theory than with the ancient Gaelic culture of their own country. Much later, in Exile, Sampson spoke a few words in Gaelic to an American jury, and he frequently reflected upon the rich native cultural heritage which at that time went unseen by the English-speaking aristocracy. William Sampson's first direct exposure to nationalist politics came at the age of 18, when he held a commission in the Irish Volunteers. I'm not sure what age he is in this picture. It's a different one from the one we've seen before, but it may not be too far off that. He held a commission in the Irish Volunteers. He was related through his mother to Colonel Sherman, one of their leaders. Originally formed as a loyal defense against foreign aggression, the Volunteers were by 1782 tentatively demanding concessions from the government. Sampson was more impressed by their honourable offers of conciliation to their Catholic brethren than by their resistance to England, for that was not much. But their modest nationalism did exert considerable pressure on the British government at a time when its authority had so recently been successfully challenged by the Americans. Indeed, in the very year that Sampson joined, the Volunteers passed the Dungannon resolutions demanding Irish legislative autonomy and other reforms, and within months, British legislative supremacy had seemingly been relinquished and the destiny of Ireland entrusted to an exclusively Protestant Irish Parliament. Before that decade's close, the stirring scenes of the French Revolution unleashed a nationalism much more potent, much more impatient, and much more furious than that of the Irish Volunteers. To idealists, the fall of the Bastille in July 1789 marked the collapse of tyranny, privilege, and corruption, and their replacement by a glittering new structure built on the equality, liberty, and fraternity of all citizens. In stark contrast, conservatives saw all social order being washed away in a river of blood. Sampson joined forces in Ireland with Catholics, Protestants, and Presbyterians who sought universal suffrage and the extension of the franchise and equal rights to the Catholic masses. This group who banded together as the aptly named United Irishmen, eventually called for a republic in Ireland and the end of colonial tyranny. The United Irishmen would lead the famous 1798 uprising in Ireland, an early indigenous political quest for a free Irish republic. Sampson was called to the Irish bar in the winter of 1792 after his training at Lincoln's Inn in London. He took lodgings in Dublin during terms at 43 Abbey Street, the broadest part, 2 or 3 rooms with use of the kitchen at £1.50 per week. And he spent his vacations in Belfast, where his residence with Grace and their 2 surviving children, 2 died in infancy, was on Arthur Street. In both cities, he mixed business and politics, being drawn over the next couple of years into the widening circle of intellectuals, all much influenced by the ideas of Tom Paine, who were profoundly disaffected with the Irish political system. Sampson's recognition of the role of class conflict in the judicial system began during his defense of sedition trials in the turbulent years leading up to the Irish Rebellion of 1798. Himself a child of the ascendancy in Ireland's deeply fractured 18th century society, Sampson recalled that the Catholics, now ground into dust, deprived of education and property and every means of acquiring either, became null in their native country. They had no part in the framing or execution of the laws, being excluded from the Parliament and the bench and from juries and from the bar. Their only duty was to bear with patience the penalties inflicted upon them and be spectators of the ludicrous though interested quarrels of their oppressors. When any question under the penal laws was tried against them, it was by a Protestant judge, a Protestant jury, and as they had a Protestant prosecutor, so they must have a Protestant advocate. What justice they could look for, heaven knows, they were shut out from all corporations and offices and every privilege belonging to freemen. In short, they were humbled below the beasts of the field. During this time, the poor Gaelic-speaking Catholic peasantry was becoming increasingly restive. Among Sampson's radical associates were William Drennan, Theobald Wolfe-Tone, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, Arthur O'Connor, Thomas Addis Emmet, William James McNevin, Samuel Neilson, Archibald Hamilton Rowan, and Thomas Russell. Within a decade, all but Drennan would be either executed or banished for their revolutionary activity. The French Revolution had given a heady philosophical content to an ideal of self-determination that the Americans had already proven attainable. Archibald Hamilton Rowan, William Drennan, and the publishers of the strongly democratic Northern Star newspaper were successively prosecuted in a series of seditious libel trials from 1794 after publishing and distributing the Irish Jacobins' democratic resolutions. According to the Attorney General Arthur Wolfe, the United Irish principle of universal emancipation and representative legislature would bury the Constitution in the anarchy of republican power formed from the dregs of the people. This was challenged by defense counsel John Philpott Curran, the leading Irish advocate of his day and, although never a member, a staunch courtroom defender of the United Irishmen. Karl Marx later judged the period of the United Irishmen to be of the highest interest scientifically and dramatically. Marx was among many who were considerably impressed by Curran's speeches for the United Irish Legal Defence Team, which were all recorded by Sampson. I consider Curran the only great lawyer, people's advocate of the 18th century, and the noblest personality, wrote Marx, while Henry Grattan was a parliamentary rogue. Sampson was not a member of Rowan's defence team, being, as he later observed, too junior to take an active part in such a trial. He nevertheless sat beside his mentor, Curran, in the courtroom and took a shorthand note of the proceedings. Later, from his cell in Newgate Prison, Rowan collected Sampson's notes of the trial with those of William Ridgway, edited the result and published it. This was an event of some significance, the first step towards Sampson's emergence as one of the earliest publishers of reliable and authentic trial reports, including every detail from the indictment through the witness examinations and cross-examinations, the testimony word for word, to the rulings of the bench and the final verdict. For Sampson, this was a political enterprise which was inseparable from his jurisprudential writings, exposing the inherently political and thus questionable nature of legal authority. Reflecting on the beginnings of his work as a court reporter, Sampson later wrote of Rowan's trial, "I was then too young in my profession to take part in a trial where the most eminent lawyers were engaged on the same side. I therefore undertook that duty by which I could best serve, that of writing down what passed, to prevent others from imposing false statements upon the public." Incidentally, these Irish trial reports he published, with one exception, anonymously, because even though true, there was the fear of his own prosecution for seditious libel. Lord Clonmel, the Chief Justice, was furious when he saw the report of Rowan's trial advertised. He challenged the printer, Patrick Byrne, and other United Irishmen, "Take care, sir, what you do. I give you this caution. For if there are any reflections on the judges of the land, by the eternal God, I will lay you by the heels." Byrne coolly thanked his lordship for the caution, adding, "I have many opportunities of going to Newgate, but I've never been ambitious of that honour." Clonmel repeated his threat, claiming that one of Rowan's advocates had misrepresented him in an inflammatory speech, and warning Byrne that if you print or publish what may inflame the mob, it behooves the judges of the land to notice it. In 1794, in the same year, Sampson began publishing his radical satirical pamphlets. He produced two scathing satires which pungently expressed his disillusionment with the legal system. These were both influenced and by and influential in the political continuation of Ireland's ancient bardic tradition, as Mary Helen Twente has shown. The Lion of Old England and the Trial of Hurdy-Gurdy were considered among the ablest satires written in the Northern Star and were later published as pamphlets. The acid pen which wrote these two pamphlets prompted Martha MacTeer to remark that Sampson was excellent at the wit and ridicule that should be the order of the day in Belfast. Sampson published also his Trial of Hurdy-Gurdy, an entertaining and stinging political satire which also advocated republican and democratic principles, but whose specific attack was against the central role of the courts in the repression of popular dissent. The unfortunate Hurdy-Gurdy, a barrel organ, was convicted for having played a seditious tune by the name of Sa Ira. Sampson's mock report of the trial depicted a biased judicial system which was the tool of a corrupt administration. Hurdy-Gurdy, the defendant, stood for the rights of an oppressed people in the face of a government determined to silence the popular dissent. The idea, surprisingly, was drawn from real events. Events had soon moved beyond mere differences of political opinion. The seeds of rebellion had already been sown. On April the 28th of 1794, the Reverend William Jackson, an Anglican clergyman who for several years had lived in France, was arrested while on a mission from the Foreign Office of his adopted country. On his trial for high treason a year later, the government presented evidence of a United Irish conspiracy to revolt with French aid. Sampson appeared as assistant counsel with Curran and also reported Jackson's trial, which was the only Irish law report he published openly under his own name. The jury convicted. During his sentencing in a crowded courtroom, Jackson collapsed and died in the dock. He had taken, or as some suspected, been administered poison in his cell. The following year, so successful was Sampson's cause lawyering that the notorious General Lake informed Chief Secretary Pelham in London that the delay in the arrival of a prison ship to Carrickfergus distresses us much and will, I fear, put us in the power of Councillor Sampson, who has declared his intention of prosecuting General Nugent and myself. During the spring assizes, the United Irish Legal Defence Team performed so well that, in the words of the manager of Lord Downshire's extensive estates, the prevarication of the evidence, the rascality of the jury, and the insulting declamation of Messrs. Curran and Sampson rendered every exertion abortive at Armagh. The same sequel to the shadow of an assize is expected this week at Carrick, and I apprehend ours will not be very different to either. One of the magistrates complained that juries would not do their duty, even after they had been charged to convict. And it would soon follow that in a very short time, agents would publicly administer the united oath under the confirmation that juries considered it legal. Sampson's experience in the courts during this period drew him further into the fray. Although convinced even then of the truths propagated by the United Irishmen, Sampson recalled that he was long in acting upon that conviction. He tried, if possible, to find some middle ground by which the most good could be effected and the most evil prevented. As this object became progressively more elusive, Sampson found himself becoming part of the struggle. He came to know and identify with the sentiments of his clients, most of whom were charged with treason, sedition, and United Irish membership. I was connected with the accused at that time by no tie, he pointed out later, but the sympathies of humanity, and certainly not by interest, since all my hopes of advancement lay the other way. He was shocked to see hundreds of thousands of his countrymen branded as traitors and living at the mercy of a corrupt administration. I was a rebel only against the crimes of treason, disloyalty, subornation of perjury, murder, torture, kidnapping, arson, and housebreaking, crimes against which I was bound by my true allegiance to rebel. Ultimately, he had to choose. Manhood could not nor ought not to endure it. And seeing the crisis at hand when there could be no more neutrality, I took in open court, in the trial of one of his clients for this offence, the oath of the United Irishmen, repeating it from the very document on which my client then stood upon his trial for his life or death. He did not do this from a spirit of bravado or romance, he said, but because I hated dissimulation and felt a consciousness that I was doing what became me, and I never have repented of it.